We're going to try. I'm Dale Campbell. For those of you who don't know, I'm retired faculty from the College of Education, Higher Education Administration. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. Up for some discussion here, but we're trying something new, and I want to thank Rick Gold and the Curriculum Committee. I'm part of the Humanities Subcommittee. That we're trying something new because those of you who are familiar with ILR, sometimes our courses are booked years out. And I have to credit my wife for this, Lynn Leverty, who's spoken to you many times. She's formerly in political science, who said, is there a way to build something in and try to focus on what are current issues? Something that, we're piloting hot topics, and we want your input on that. Rick happened to recommend I contact Danaya with the Center of Governmental Responsibility at the College of Law. I'm not going to introduce her in terms of extensive bio because you can see that by clicking on the website. So we have more time, but most importantly, given this topic, she has lived it dearly, having served as chair of the Faculty Senate, I think, if I'm correct, 2 terms during Ben Sass's short tenure as president. So we're real pleased that Dana and the center is going to help lead this initiative in identifying crucial issues that you have a hand in selecting for future issues that we can explore in more depth. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Danaya Wright and thank her.
Thank you, Dale. Oh, goodness. Okay, that works. Thank you, Dale. Gosh, it's a little off. It's either on or off, but anyway. I want to just mention one thing that Dale contacted me about doing these topics, and my immediate thought was, well, I read the news every day. I'm a complete news junkie, and there's so many things in the news, so many things. I couldn't even come up with, I couldn't identify 6 that would be the hot topics. So we sent around an email to the first 20 or so of you who registered. So we did not get everybody, but we got the first 20 or so and asked some topics. And one topic that came up was everything's going on in higher ed, because so many of you are involved with UF, and that happened to be one that I could talk about, so I thought we would do that one first. We also got some interest in immigration and what's going on, everything from deportations to immigration law to alligator Alcatraz to the lawsuits. So we will have Juan Caballero, who runs our immigration law clinic at the law school, will be here next week to talk about that one. We got that was one of the highest number of the relatively small number of you who were able to respond. We got a number of those. The following week we have, so that'll be so next week is the 18th. The 25th, we've scheduled Amanda Phelan, who is a professor of economics in the College of Business, and she's going to talk about tariffs and the budget bill and all of the economic impact of this big bill. I'm not going to call it big, beautiful bill, but the big bill. And then we also have scheduled, we don't have it scheduled, but we've got in the works a con law professor at the law school who will come and talk about all the recent decisions before the Supreme Court. So especially the national injunctions, birthright citizenship bill or lawsuit, but the trans healthcare lawsuit, there were a number. This year wasn't quite as spectacular as last year, but we thought it's always good to have a Supreme Court update for one of our topics. So those, we've sort of scheduled those. If you don't want those, let us know. And then some of the others that got some interest, we put on the piece of paper and are passing around and are happy to try to find somebody who can talk about those. So the other thing is how do we structure this? And we talked about wanting it to be more of a discussion group, but at the same time, I think it's important that there's stuff to talk about. So what I've told the speakers who I've scheduled is about 30 minutes to present on whatever the topic is, and then 30 minutes for discussion. And hopefully it'll be a discussion and not just a Q&A like it normally is. So with that, I'm going to talk about, well, I am going to talk about Florida, a lot of the assaults on higher education right now. And I know many of you are interested in it. So I'm going to talk, this has been a process that the state has been going through. And so I'm going to talk about some of the prohibited content law, the mandated content law, the creation of our conservative centers, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, post-tenure review, accreditation, presidential searches, parental rights movement, research cuts, and then I'm going to end with just briefly talking about Project 2025. So we can see how things have gone along. So as most of you know, Florida sort of led the pack here on legislation trying to regulate higher education. So it began in 2023, I think it was 23. No, it was 22, excuse me. In 22, we began with the Stop Woke Act, House Bill 7 that was passed. And that bill said that you cannot teach about race, systemic racism, unconscious racism, or that virtues such as merit, excellence, fairness, and hard work are racist or sexist. But they can be taught if presented in an objective manner. So this was the first bill that really started to interfere with what goes on in the classroom. In November of 2022, Judge Mark Walker enjoined it as being overly vague, unclear, overbroad, had a chilling effect on First Amendment rights, right? Because you don't know. Nobody knows whether they are talking, if you're talking about the Civil War, is your conversation going to run afoul of the law? So, we don't indoctrinate, but at the same time, we do teach, right? We do try to teach facts and information. And so Judge Walker said clearly a violation. And so it was enjoined. The 11th Circuit allowed the injunction to remain during the appeal. And then ultimately the 11th, so, and actually this part of the Stop Woke Act had two pieces. One piece that influenced or was supposed to regulate universities. The other was to regulate employers. The employer piece of it has been permanently enjoined as of July 2024. But the university part has not been permanently enjoined, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So I think it was pretty clear that the first effort that the legislature made to try to interfere with what goes on in the college classroom was a failure. It was a clear violation of the First Amendment. So they changed tacts. So in the following year, in Senate Bill 266, we got mandated content. So the mandated content, Florida has two categories of general education courses. There's the core, and then there's what are called non-core general ed courses. So for the core courses, they prohibit certain viewpoints. Up here, general ed core courses may not distort significant historical events or include a curriculum that teaches identity politics, such as critical race theory, or defines American history as contrary to the creation of a new nation based on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence, or that violates 1000.05, which of course is the Stop Woke Act that's been enjoined. And it can't be based on theories of racism, sexism, oppression, or privilege. So in the core, the state legislature has decided that just like they can control K through 12 curriculum and the content in K through 12 curriculum, they felt they could control the content in the core general ed courses. So these are courses that are required across all the 12 university systems. They also removed sociology as a potential core course because it has been hijacked by left-wing activists and no longer serves its intended purpose as a general knowledge course for students. So it got removed. So the core now, they could go ahead, even though there's this First Amendment, that says you can't interfere, you can't tell people they can't teach these subjects. In core courses, they're treating the core general ed curriculum like K through 12 curriculum and are prohibiting content. In the non-core courses, the legislature has instead sort of mandated things that they're supposed to be teaching. So the legislature finds it necessary to ensure that every undergraduate student graduates as an informed citizen, which is great. They're to get general ed courses that promote and preserve the constitutional republic through traditional, historically accurate, and high quality coursework that provides broad foundational knowledge to help them develop intellectual skills. I don't know about you. I feel like that's what I do. I already do that. I think we all do that. We're all trying to teach students intellectual skills and habits that enable them to become more effective and lifelong learners. So it's really kind of hard to know. This language is incredibly difficult to apply. Whenever applicable, they are to promote the philosophical underpinnings of Western civilization and include studies of this nation's historical documents like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and subsequent amendments. And then courses with a curriculum based on unproven speculative or exploratory content are not good for gen ed courses. So the attack on gen ed was very creative to prohibit certain content for the curriculum, for the core courses, and then mandate certain, constitutional, civic, Republican ideas in the non-core courses. And then, of course, if we didn't at UF or in every other school, if we didn't review all of our core courses, we would lose funding. So that was where they went with the First Amendment. The prohibited content really didn't work. So they drilled down and went at the core courses, the general ed courses. They also have instituted these conservative centers at 3 of the universities. We have the Hamilton School now. Used to be the Hamilton Center. It's now the Hamilton School, the Adam Smith Center, and the Florida Institute for Governance and Civics. And those institutions are to educate students in the principles, ideals, and institutions of the American political order. And they intend that the Board of Governors shall align the missions of each constituent university with the education for citizenship of the constitutional republic. So this is a way to not say, oh, you can't teach this, but you have to teach this over here. And they're very well funded. Let me tell you, they're very well funded, which creates a lot of bad feelings among the classics department and the philosophy department, the political science department, the history department that are not as well funded. But anyway. So one of the main thing that Senate Bill 266 does is when the legislature says, faculty, you can't talk about this stuff, it ran afoul of the First Amendment, right? You can't tell people they can't teach that stuff. But let's just tell the university to tell their faculty they can't teach that. So what Senate Bill 266 did is it says that each university has to submit documentation of its efforts to promote the education for citizenship of the constitutional republic and the cultivation of the intellectual autonomy of its undergraduates. So we're supposed to promote intellectual autonomy of our undergraduates. It also has to submit, as a component of the university's annual accountability plan, information on how they are removing from its course catalogs any specified major or minor in critical race theory, gender studies, or intersectionality, or any derivative major of these belief systems. That is, any major that engenders beliefs in those concepts described in section 1000.05, which is, of course, the very first law that's been enjoined, that's been struck down. So they're tying the university up. They're telling us you have to teach intellectual autonomy, but yet you can't teach those courses. You've got to get those subjects out of your course catalog. So it's one thing, you can't tell a faculty member who's teaching, let's say, a history course, that you can't talk about race, or you can't talk about sex, or you can't talk about certain subjects if they're appropriate to the course. But you can tell the university you can't have those courses. You can't have those subjects, those degrees, those majors. And that's where they're moving. They're trying to actually remove those subjects from the curriculum. It hasn't happened though, right? University of Florida has not complied. We still have the Gender Studies program. We still have African American Studies Center. So I don't know. That has so far not been enforced, in large part because this is unconstitutional, right? So UF does have some wiggle room. We were given that the BOG is going to periodically review all of our curriculum and make sure that we don't violate that unconstitutional provision. But there's an exception in Senate Bill 266 for a nationally recognized and ranked university that has a global perspective and impact. So it has to be able to compete on the national stage. And so even in the Florida bill, there was this language that said, you know, we got to let UF have a little more room. But we're not going to let the other universities necessarily have so much room. And then the BOG is supposed to develop a strategic plan that sets out our accountability plan. So that was sort of that's been the plan, the MO for how they're going to control woke curriculum in the classroom. Then we have our prohibited expenditures. So then turning to DEI, the bill said no university may expend any state or federal funds or maintain any programs or campus activities that violate 1000.05. Well, that's our unconstitutional content discrimination. And then, or advocate for DEI as defined by rules of the State Board of Education, rules of the BOG. So this is an interesting approach. The way in which the legislature has gone after DEI is they haven't said, oh, you can't have DEI. They've said, you can't spend money for DEI. And then the BOG there's some exceptions, student fees, student-led organizations can do whatever they want. And the statute does not prohibit programs that are necessary for compliance with general or federal laws, for obtaining or retaining institutional or discipline-specific accreditation, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and for access programs. And then finally, the bill bans courses based on unproven theoretical or exploratory content. So this idea that DEI is unproven, theoretical, exploratory, and there's really no good definition of DEI either. So interestingly, the Board of Governors does have a definition of DEI. It's any program, campus activity, or policy that classifies individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, gender identity, or sexual orientation, and promotes differential or preferential treatment of individuals on the basis of such classification. I would argue that single-sex bathrooms is a violation of this regulation. It is a classification on the basis of sex that treats people differently. I think gender-specific locker rooms, gender-specific sports teams, I think they all violate this definition of DEI. And of course, we don't have any better definition coming out of the federal government. We don't know what DEI is, right? They can't seem to really define it. But this is the Board of Governors definition. However, at the same time, we have Board of Governors Regulation 2.003, which is called it used to be called our Equity and Access Regulation, mandating that every university have a plan for how to promote equity and access. And we changed it to equal access and opportunity. So we can't have DEI, but we're required to have equal access and opportunity programs. I don't know. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, pregnancy, religion, age, disability, marital status, all of that's protected, and we have to have programs that promote equal access and opportunity, but we can't have DEI. So that's what we're dealing with at the university level, is trying to figure out, what do they mean? How do you know? And how would a judge know if you're in violation? Because these definitions are so poor. Um, all right, another area that of legislative assaults, I guess, attacks, has been to impose post-tenure review. So this was that the BOG has to adopt a regulation requiring post-tenure review, which looks at accomplishments and productivity and performance measures and all sorts of things. And a lot of people have said this is basically getting rid of tenure because tenured faculty have claimed academic freedom both in their research and in the classroom. And this article just came out May 19th, 2025. It was a research study on the impact of post-tenure review evaluations on faculty productivity in the state of Florida. And in that study, they found that that the post-tenure review weakened tenure protections, and they compared faculty outcomes to nearby states and found that the policy increased faculty exits, brain drain, and they detected no productivity gains among those who stayed. So post-tenure review seems to have caused brain drain so far in the state of Florida, according to this one research study, which is the first one that's come out of the University of Southern California. Another area where we have a lot going on is accreditation. And accreditation is it's a really interesting area. You have to be accredited in order to have access to federal funds. So federal research funds, but also student aid funds and various other federal funds. So Florida added the classical learning test to the ACT and the SAT, which until Florida adopted it, had only been adopted by faith-based colleges. So they added that as a test for students for admission. They also then passed a law that required every SUS university to change institutional accreditors the next time they were up, because they were upset that our regional accreditor, SACS, had sort of come down hard on UF in particular with regard to a conflict of interest dispute earlier and to some of the things that were going, I don't know, some of the shenanigans. It is important to keep track that there are institutional accreditors and program accreditors. So the College of Medicine, the College of Law, they have their own program accreditors, but then SACS and the Western States accreditors, and they accredit the entire institution. Every institutional accreditor except SACS has a DEI requirement. And so one of the reasons that the legislature passed a law to require that we change accreditors was they didn't like that SACS was saying, wait a minute, what are you doing with DEI? And they were afraid that we would lose accreditation if we got rid of our DEI. And yet our accreditor is the only one that makes it optional. Every other accreditor made a DEI program mandatory. So changing was just going to put us into an accreditor that was going to demand that we do more in the area of DEI. The cost of changing accreditors is between $11 and $13 million. Well, I'm sorry, across the entire system. It's around $1 million per institution just to do the paperwork and change the accreditors. The Trump administration has hounded regional accreditors to remove their DEI requirements, and the ABA has also done so. So as far as I know, all DEI requirements from accreditation have all been removed. Nonetheless, DeSantis announced just last week the creation of this Commission for Public Higher Education. Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas are going to create their own accrediting agency. But it will take about 2 years for that accrediting agency to really get up and running. And the Florida legislature gave the Board of Governors $4 million to facilitate this. I just want us to think about how much of this do we really need to be spending tax dollars on. But Was it really that bad? Okay, open presidential searches. I'm sure you all are familiar with what happened with the University of Florida's presidential search. So you know that in 2022, there was an exception to presidential searches that was an open records and open meetings laws that had originally required that presidential searches be open. They closed that. They also, the Board of Governors changed its regulations to mandate more Board of Governors members on presidential search committees, and that they pre-approve presidential contracts for university presidents in advance. There was an effort to repeal that statute, which would have then returned presidential searches back to the sunshine, but it failed to pass. It passed in the House, but not the Senate in May here. So just as an update on where we are with presidential searches, there were no searches at FIU, West Florida, New College, or FAMU. Those people were all put in as interims with no searches, and then at least FIU and New College have been converted to permanent presidents with no searches at all. There were controversial searches at Florida Atlantic. I think that was the one that took 3 searches, when then there was an investigation by the Board of Governors into whether the search firm had violated the law or not. And then Florida Gulf Coast had a controversial search, but they ended up with it was a 6-7 vote of their Board of Trustees to appoint an academic. I think their provost. They promoted their provost up. And then, of course, UF, you know what's going on with our UF search. There are searches underway now at the University of South Florida and at UF. And that we still have stable leadership at North Florida, Florida Poly, Florida State, and University of Central Florida. So just since 2022, 3 years, 8 of our 12 Florida state universities have gotten new presidents. And most of them have been appointed without searches. And only the Florida Gulf Coast seems to have sort of been what I would call a normal search. Actually, Florida Poly did that a couple years ago, and they hired an academic, a typical academic for that. Of course, that's not just in universities, but a number of state colleges. There's been at least 10 politicians have now been appointed to presidential positions in the state universities and in colleges, which is unprecedented anywhere in the country. This number of politicians who don't have any higher ed experience. But since when do you need higher ed experience to run a $10 billion institution like the University of Florida? I do think it's interesting that one of DeSantis's tactics has been replacement of board members. He has been very aggressive at changing university boards of trustees. He's been aggressive with the Board of Governors. He's been aggressive with school boards. And of course, I'm sure you all remember when he went after and changed the Disney board. So the Reedy Creek Improvement District would no longer be controlled by Disney. We have not seen a lot of pushback on those board changes, but there was a lawsuit brought against the New College Board of Trustees for breach of fiduciary duties. And I do think, at least with regard to the Disney board, that would be it'd be really easy legally to challenge some of their actions. If they were, I don't know if you remember, there were threats that DeSantis said something like, well, we'll put a prison next door to the Magic Kingdom. And I think if they did that, you could argue breach of fiduciary duty. So there's some legal wiggle room on the job that the boards are supposed to be doing. New College of Florida, of course, is a blueprint for taking over the left-wing woke institutions. And that really started by replacing 6 board members. Then they replaced the president with Richard Corcoran, a former legislator. They canceled the gender studies program and dumped all the books. They offered athletic scholarships to hundreds of students for 6 teams. A third of the faculty left. New hires of faculty are some pretty well-known right-wing ideologues who have been getting double, triple the salaries that regular faculty members get at New College. Their admission standards have declined. 30 plus students transferred to Hampshire College. They fell in the rankings from 76 in 22 to 123 to 122 in 2024. They've fallen that far in the rankings. And they have been investigated by SACS and reprimanded by the AAUP for violating certain governance standards at New College. Is University of West Florida the next one? Hard to know. DeSantis has appointed 5 new members to the UWF trustees. 2 of them were not affirmed by the Senate, in particular Scott Yaner, who said something about women were meddlesome, medicated, and I forget what the other word was. It was lovely. But Manny Diaz was appointed interim president. So at least in terms of the roadmap, the blueprint for New College, they're doing the same thing at West Florida. Another part of what we've seen in the sort of trying to regulate universities and higher ed is this parental rights movement. And it started really at the K through 12 level, but has moved a little bit. It's a somewhat different movement than trying to take out higher ed, but it also is caused a lot of issues in higher ed. So this parental rights movement is really aimed at limiting discussions on gender, sexuality, and race in public schools, including higher ed, preventing the use of preferred pronouns, prohibiting the teaching of LGBTQ issues, eliminating sex ed, although I think we had already done that, prohibiting trans athletes from competing on women's teams. We have, of course, the Don't Say Gay bill and the book banning, all are sort of motivated by this parental rights movement. More than 20 states have introduced bills, but only a few have passed, including Florida. And the Supreme Court just last week in Mahmoud versus Taylor upheld parental rights to remove children from LGBTQ-themed classroom content. So the parental rights movement is charging along. Grants and cuts. As you've, I'm sure, heard, we have seen historic cuts to National Science Foundation grants, down 51% from $2 billion to $989 billion on average. I think it's interesting that our STEM education grants are down 80%. Right? Why are we reducing STEM education grants? You know, okay, I know we don't like transgender athletes and we don't like LGBTQ issues, but really STEM? Grad education, zero grants. National Institutes of Health grants have in the new bill are down from $48 billion to $27 billion is the amount of money that's been allocated. However, I don't know how much you've been paying attention. Judge William Young held that terminated NIH grants had to be reinstated. So the ones that are already been allocated have to be reinstated. Referring to the termination of grants, he said he had in 4 decades on the bench never seen such a record where racial discrimination was so palpable. And you are bearing down on people of color because of their color, the judge said. The Constitution will not permit that. And it's been appealed to the First Circuit, but Judge Young did not stay his injunction, which means that the grants need to continue to go forward. They're not allowed to. They have to, there's no pause, because any pause would be detrimental to the recipients of these NIH grants. So I think there's a number of grounds for legal challenge for these cuts, both to research, to NSF and NIH grants, including just on equal protection and due process grounds. Are these grants are we cutting grants based on race or sex? There's an argument that the Impoundment Act, which is an act that if Congress has allocated the money, the executive branch doesn't have the authority to not spend it. So Impoundment Act is a grounds of challenge. We also have contract terms. for instance, of pre-existing contracts as potential grounds. And at the end of the day, the rational basis test. The rational basis test says that government action cannot be arbitrary and capricious. And it does sort of seem that maybe some of this is arbitrary and capricious. So I think there's a lot of what's been happening since January with all of these efforts, in particular with higher ed. There are grounds, but we've never had to test some of these before in this context, right? In the context of higher ed. The Big Beautiful Bill's changes to higher ed. In particular, we have reduced Pell Grants and student loans, increased endowment tax from 1.4% to 8%. That's going to hurt some of the more elite institutions that were using those endowments for student financial aid. Institutional accountability for student income levels. This is an interesting one. As somebody who got a lot of degrees and didn't want to leave school, and then they kept kicking you out when they gave you a degree, and so I'd go find another school to go to because I didn't really want to get a job. The fact that if I didn't go get a job, that would now injure my institution, because we're going to hold institutions accountable for the decisions of graduates. If graduates choose that they just want to go on a trip around the world or go camping in the mountains and not get a job, that's going to come back and hurt these institutions. We're already seeing that in the rankings for law schools. Students who go on to graduate degrees doesn't count. They capped the overhead funding for the NIH and NSF funding at 15%, reduced research funding, and Medicaid and other assistance programs are also, that are being reduced, are going to affect a lot of low-income college students. So the new bill that just passed on July 4th is going to bring some pretty significant changes to higher ed. So this is my last comment. Project 2025, which I don't know how many of you spend a lot of time looking at it. It's very long. It's very complicated. But these are the main higher ed goals in Project 2025. So close the Department of Education, eliminate woke propaganda in public schools, federal enforcement of civil rights to be limited to the litigation led by the Department of Justice. We're moving it out of the Department of Education, which is where civil rights litigation had been held. Eliminate disparate impact analysis of schools. That means we can only look at intent. Did the institution intend to discriminate, not do they actually have that impact? Rescind the Biden administration's Title IX policies on sex discrimination, get rid of all forgiveness for student loans, eliminate public funding for all education, Head Start and school meals. This is all in 2025. Curtail research expenditures, expand school choice, limit sex to male, female, cut off funding to states, cities, and counties that disagree with the parental rights, ban critical race theory and gender ideology for public school curriculum, rescind the NEA's congressional charter, eliminate PLUS loans in the Gear Up program, cap indirect cost rates paid to universities, and privatize the federal student loan portfolio. This is Project 2025. The yellow are the ones that have been accomplished, and the turquoise are the ones that are in progress for higher ed. And as far as I know, I don't think they've rescinded the NEA's congressional charter, but that could have been lost in the news. There's been so much. So that's all. Basically, the solution is to cut funding. So with that, I have a conversation. No, you don't need to clap. I know I went through it very, very quickly, and I don't know how much of it people are interested in, but probably something I want to talk about.
Yes, and if you would, we have folks online, and Pam, you're going to repeat the question.
No, I just want to respond to that comment that you don't know how good you were, but you were very, very good. You covered many aspects that, of course, we were unaware. And it seemed to be all factual. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable enough to discredit anything that you said, which is the problem with a discussion group. If you're going to make such a beautiful presentation and give us all the facts and convince us all
Oh,
that
good.
there's,
Did I convince you?
yeah, that there's this assault on education, the only people that will disagree with you will be the people who are not swayed by science or facts. So I'm wondering about the format of this.
I leave it up to you all. I mean, I think there are certainly criticisms of higher ed that deserve to be leveled at it. And yet we are the envy of the world. More international students come to U.S. institutions. We're not perfect. We don't have good access for everybody. We don't provide, as many resources, I think, as we should. Perhaps, I mean, I'm certainly open to saying that if you're going to take a class on critical race theory, you're probably going to talk about racism. But those classes aren't mandatory. And so, and a lot of the research funding, I do think that the attacks on research, the cuts on research are really harming these institutions because that's how they survive.
Yeah, and one thing we want to be sure that, again, we want to improve and get your feedback. So that's part of the purpose of this. So please let us know. Yes, sir.
I have a story from Illinois, which is not as bad as Florida. And when I got to the blessed point of retirement from teaching, I was friends with my state senator, who was a Republican, and decent guy, thoughtful, and he wanted me to sell his new law on education reform in Illinois. And I said, well, I couldn't do it because when he wanted me to do it, I was on my first snowbirding trip to Florida. So anyway, I said to him, well, let me at least look at the law. It took me 1 minute to realize this was a crock. And then former colleagues of mine were really up in arms about this afterwards. But his attempts were well-meaning, but he basically has no clue about what it's like in the classroom.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with these politicians. They do not understand the reality of what we deal with.
I don't know about you, but I know that if I taught constitutional law and did not teach some of these subjects, my students would criticize me. They would call me old-fashioned. You're not teaching the good stuff, right? They really put a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah.
And so you can tell the younger generation not to think about these topics, but good luck with that.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to comment on the gentleman behind me's. For discussion groups to work well, the people attending have to do a little bit of research so that they have a knowledge base, or we're just talking about opinions then. Okay. And since we're not sending out things for people to read, I think this format is a good one. Okay. Essentially, you provided the research that we would have done to prepare for this. But I have a question that I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to hear comments from others in the room as well. Why is it that the government has launched this attack on higher education? What is behind it? In other words, is it that they're trying to start with the young to control the population? I mean, what's your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think that the young people, they have the energy. They're the ones doing the protests, right? And they're the ones that are always going to be pushing the envelope. And that's where the protests happen. And so somehow bringing higher education institutions, curbing them, bringing them to heel seems to be an attempt to quell dissent. I mean, that's where I think it is, but I'm happy to hear.
Thanks. I've been involved in advocacy at the Florida legislature against the Don't Say Gay Back and bill and the Stop Woke Act and others, and been really disturbed that no one's being listened to, particularly the educators. Within the last year, I've also been victim of the elimination of my former agency, USAID, and also the attack on Harvard, which I attended. And so I was wondering if you could at least address the use of positions on anti-Semitism as an excuse for clamping down on academic freedom and university management, which I think should have some implications for Florida as well as some of the Ivy Leagues.
That one's such a difficult topic. So I don't want to get in on too much, but I do think that the attacks that began in 2022 on higher education are really about changing the conversation, obviously, and trying to tamp down dissent. And they see universities, just like we did in the 60s and 70s, as the hotbeds of protest. That's where the civil rights movement came out. And generally speaking, college educated people tend to be more liberal. And that's something that is, they just tend more centrist, more liberal, generally speaking. And so that's been the mode of attack. But the Don't Say Gay bill, what's really going on here is they know that none of this, very little of it, is constitutional. Very little of it, like that very first slide I showed of it's all a violation of the First Amendment to tell people you can't talk, you can't protest, you can't do, but by using these vague definitions and by talking about wokeness and by threatening faculty with losing their jobs, you are, creating this chilling effect that then causes people to shut up, and that's been effective. It's been effective in other countries.
I just want to mention one thing. I can't underscore enough how important this course is. And I spent about 20 minutes this morning with a person who happens to be very, very right-wing. And when I asked the person what programs they were watching Fox News and related shows. And I asked if they had ever looked at the New York Times and the Washington Post. And you would think I asked him if he was going to eat dog poop or something. He was really reacted facially that I could tell he thought that they were just the worst liars going. We have a serious problem with a lot of people being conditioned. And I feel you are bringing out the facts, but my biggest worry is the people that are conditioned. It's kind of the same thing when a woman's been kidnapped and then all of a sudden falls in love with the kidnapper. It's that same kind of thing. It's very tough to get at it.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this.
I mean, I want this whole conversation to basically be, these are topics that are in the news right now, and we need to know what's going on with them.
he's going around there. There's a comment online from the
Oh.
Zoomer. It seems to me this is headed to brainstorming students that are in fascist Germany and a form of blackmail to education.
Yes. I mean, I think it's your perspective. Some people think that students go into the classroom and they're told they have to believe certain things. They have to believe in, systemic racism or intersectionality or whatever we even mean by gender ideology. I don't know, that there's multiple sexes, that there's not just two. And the problem is you've got a whole lot of professional organizations that regulate what gets taught and what gets said. Right? You have peer review, you have professional groups like the AMA. So, and the AMA there's a dispute on vaccines, but the AMA takes the experts and tries to provide expert opinion about that. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing here, is that the experts are being silenced, and the experts are in higher ed.
So in terms of some feedback, this is our first meeting here. I did enjoy the presentation. I didn't learn too much, but that's not a criticism. I know many of the topics on the list that we've seen seem to be fairly liberal kind of viewpoint, which I fully subscribe to, but it doesn't really help me. I have some recent experience in another discussion group where we had more of both sides presented. And I'm not looking to change anybody's mind, because I realize that's very hard to do, but I do enjoy and value hearing what the other opposing views are. And that's what I think would be more useful for me and maybe others in the room. Speaking in an echo chamber doesn't really help me very much, and doesn't really help. But that's not a criticism of you at all, just the format.
That's fine.
Well, thank you. I take that as a compliment for our discussion group. I think that a lot of what you went over is a reaction by the new political people who are in power, the conservatives, because it's happening mostly in the red states. It's a reaction to actions. And I think it goes back to the 1970s, to the movement where the universities were, for all intent and purposes, you had the the YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, that basically was the power up until the 60s.
Yeah.
And then what happened was there's significant change in the power structure in the universities and in a lot of the blue states. And I think what we're seeing here in the red states is a reaction to that. And I think it's a reaction to kids going to college bringing pup tents with them to be able to protest. And of course, they didn't bring the pup tents with them. Somebody gave them the pup tents. But I think it's a reaction to seeing the universities taken over by these, I would say, extremely radical groups, anti-Semitic, anti-American, many of them burn American flags in some of the universities also. So I think that's what part of that is. I think that, and over time, things will probably settle down, and there'll be a back to more of a normality. There shouldn't be this kind of conflicts on the college campuses. There should be some kind of understanding of, well, I've said enough.
I do think that's an interesting point, because universities have been where protests generally have happened, right? It's the young people that have been at the forefront of protest. And so whenever I see the young people protesting, I don't care what they're protesting. Just, yay, you're out on the streets and you're not on your cell phones. So I'm sort of encouraging. But
Yes, I can
more easily understand the current administration and their supporters' objection to certain fields of study which have been mentioned, sociology, perspectives of the way people relate to one another, and things that relate to the goodness or effectiveness of law, and whether it's dealt out in a way that is as equal as humans are capable of. But I do not understand a, a major emphasis on things that, on subjects that stem from STEM, and by which I would mean science, ideas about immunology and vaccinations, use of chemicals which have long been proven to prevent tooth decay, and other things that throughout almost my entire 83 years of living, in the beginning of those 83 years, we were stupid about some of those things. The dentists in high fluoride area broke their drills trying to drill what they thought were cavities, but which were actually fluorinosis. But that's past knowledge. What is driving arguments against extremely well accepted medical health issues? Why would we be told that that if we don't want fluoride in our water, we should somehow choose not to get it when it's almost impossible to make that kind of a choice? And why would someone want to experiment with a proven health aid? It seems to me that this is a rejection of fundamental and easily understood things.
I agree with you. I mean, I do think it's interesting though, and I will throw that out to all of you to think about, is why do we assume that there's truth in science, medical facts? Now, there's a lot of stuff we don't know, but we feel like once we sort of, oh, we figured out DNA. So, you know, and we don't tend, I don't think most of us don't challenge we don't believe in the flat earth anymore, right? Like we've pretty much gotten to the idea that the sun is this, right? All of that sort of scientific truth. But we don't accept any kind of truth, or we tend not to accept the idea of truth in social sciences, in philosophy, in history. And that has really, and in political science, right? Like in politics. And, you know, there's so many studies on, let's say, gender-based violence. Like there's just so many studies on this that we can't say it doesn't exist. And so, but how you're going to solve the problem, there seem to be some people who want to question the facts, the underlying facts, as well as what we're going to do to solve it. Whereas in medicine, we agree on sort of the underlying facts. And we may even agree on some of the solutions. But I don't understand why we don't look at some of those things as more scientific. Because they talk about, we can't indoctrinate. We can't teach about these unknown theories. Well, Einstein's theory of relativity is an unproven theory. And yet, clearly, that's not what they're talking about in the statute when they say you can't teach unproven theories. Sorry.
Earlier, there was a question relating to what's the motivation for all of this, and I think, for the last 15 or 20 years, before I was retired and more actively involved professionally, I kept going to conferences and they're talking about, okay, here's what the demographics are going to be. Here's the direction things are going. You can't argue with demographics. That's just the way it's going to be. I think that's one variable that is magnified by a second one. And that is, if you look at history, it's really difficult to find any group who is in power who willingly gives up that power. And so a lot of this is about trying, in my mind at least, is about trying to argue with demographics.
Yeah, we're going to need to close down right now, and I need to close this off, but in respect of our time and all, we have sheets here that if you haven't had one, I've got some in the back and I'll hand out after we close this portion. But I think it's important. We really do want your input for future topics to make this relevant of your interest, and we have some leeway. And of course, we have some limitations based on a short time frame who we can secure. So if you'll, it's by no means trying to limit topics or their different perspectives and discussion on this. I will make a comment, and I retired in 2018. So this is 7 years ago. Higher ed was my field. I wish I would have known about that section in the law for research universities that I doubt faculty in this university know, that there's the exception. Because of my colleagues and former students, I got called to speak at UNF for one of my former students, their master's program in higher ed, to come over and talk. Because I was retired, I could share a perspective that associate prof tenure couldn't share. A lot of this is driven by fear, sadly. And so how do you overcome a climate of fear? Our goal through this is to help promote discussion, dialogue, solutions, future endeavors. And let's give Danaya and the center an outstanding round of applause.